Excellent. Right, we're recording again.
Now I forgot everything we talked about.
I know exactly the point we were up to. You were just saying, so let's just explain to viewers, we are having real technical problems with keeping a video link and getting it recorded on Skype. So now we've changed over to Zoom. So if the format's slightly different, apologies. We were just saying, before we were so rudely interrupted, that the suicide rate or the rate of attack on psychiatrists was the highest that you'd ever come across.
Well, I noticed that at the state hospital that psychiatrists were being attacked at a rate higher than any of the other doctors, who just the main medical doctors. And that was pretty clear. And I'm like, why are they attacking these guys? What are psychiatrists? I mean, then they were so overworked at the state hospital that they didn't have much time to, piss these guys off. And kind of like, what are they doing in 15 or 20 minutes? To pissing off these guys and getting slammed for it, because there were always psychiatrists getting assaulted, and like I said, their assault rate was much higher than well, not much higher, but it was about equal to that of attendants who worked on the psych floors, who were around these guys all the time. So I went and looked this up, and according to the Journal of the American Medical Association, some other interesting stuff came up also. The suicide rate for psychiatrists is 65 per 100,000, or 5.9 times higher than that of the general population, which I found was interesting. Now, another thing that was very interesting is that's about equivalent with that of schizophrenics themselves. And when I saw that, I was like, boom, what is going on here? Their suicide rate is much higher than any other doctor.
What do you put that down to, Jerry? Because I've known that for some time, that they've got a very high suicide rate relative to other professions or even other strands of medicine. My feeling is always they don't really understand what they're doing. They're playing with stuff they don't understand, and it hooks into all of their own demonic, their demons from their past and all of their own stuff. And they're confronted with their ineffectiveness, daily. That's what I think. But
well, I think so too. I mean, most of them. I can't think of one that I thought was a spiritual type person. They were all in their heads. They all, or most of them, not all of them, but most of them had these humongous egos. They were in control. They had worked themselves up to the top of the pecking order as far as psych goes. They were the ones giving the commands. But, they weren't really talking to these patients. They were telling the patients what, the patients would try to tell them, well, hey, these hallucinations are real. I mean, they're not hallucinations. They go, they are hallucinations, and you're psychotic, and you're crazy, and you're a lunatic, and nobody believes what you say, and we're not going to listen to anything you say because you're crazy. So they lost their voice. And you look what happens to schizophrenics when they try to tell people what's going on with them. People, even their friends, go, you're hearing voices that are telling you bad things, and they're telling you to, and it's a lot of it is embarrassing stuff, that they don't want to talk to people about. And they quickly find out that other people, and I've talked to a number of them, thought everybody heard them at first. They find out that other people don't hear them, that if they do talk to other people about them, then other people think they're strange or possessed, or they start backing away. They lose friends. Their parents start worrying about them, thinking they're strange. There is no positive benefit for these people to speak of their voices. And on top of that, their voices are telling them not to tell anybody about them, because if they do, they're going to get locked up and drugged up. And so what they try to do is just to cope, and they withdraw, and they go into their bedrooms and they close the door, and they don't want to deal with anybody, because here's these voices raging in their head and nobody understands, you know, and they're, like you said, they're isolated. They're totally isolated. And then when they go to a psychiatrist, you know, the family eventually drags them down there, and then they drug them silly like you experience, and the side effects of those meds are not great. You know, they're better than being psychotic, but they're not good.
No, that's something I wanted to ask you about actually shortly. But my experience of my own schizophrenia was this complete isolation from the world that you know. It's like you've been removed, your body's here, you're moving around, but you are in a parallel universe. You're just not actually here. And it feels like your life force is being sucked from your body and it's going somewhere else. That's
exactly what's happening. That's exactly what's happening. Yeah. These things they're energy parasites. And
we haven't gone into this yet. I mean, because for some people, Jerry, watching this is going to be like woo-woo. This is going to be like really bizarre, because you're calling these voices energy parasites.
Yes, and that's exactly what they are. And it took years to find that out.
Okay.
It took years to find that out. And I denied it for years.
I want to hear what you understand by energy parasites, because this is heresy. You know, when you look at,
yes, it is.
This is heresy, and we shouldn't be talking about it, because the psychiatrists say that if you talk about this, you're in the land of weirdness. You know, like this is.
Well, I've got one foot in both worlds that I have had for a long time.
So tell me what you understand. How did you come to that conclusion that these were entity attachments, or?
Well, the way I came to that conclusion was when I was working in the prison. So while I was working in the state hospital, if a patient got upset because I was asking them questions, that would be noticed. You know, it's like I've been pulled up in front of psychiatrists saying, "You're upsetting my patients by asking them questions about their hallucinations. I don't want you upsetting my patients asking them about hallucinations. They're you know, they don't need to be upset, and I got enough problems on my hands with these massive caseloads, and I don't need to be dealing with upset patients because they're upset you're asking them about these questions. And that happened twice there, where the patient, you know, I kind of misjudged how much I could trust them, and they went to the psychiatrist and said, this guy's really irritating me with his questions about the voices, and he's upsetting me. And I get pulled in and go, you will stop that. You will stop it now. You know? But once I got into prison and the psychology department there, a complaint like that in the prison environment did not even reach above the ambient noise level. You know, if they went to the warden and said, "Hey man, he's asking me questions about my voices and he's pissing me off," you know, they'd be like, "Hey, that's the least of my worries, bub." You know, I didn't get in trouble there until they started recovering. And then I got in trouble in a lot of ways. I mean, I got in trouble from, I was put under investigation by the chief psychologist. He had other psychologists come and ask these patients what the first thing my supervisor noticed was that where all the other psychs in the department, the prison, could only stand being around and working with schizophrenics for maybe 10, 15 minutes at a time. You know, they didn't understand them. They didn't know what was going on. They weren't trying to understand. They checked to make sure they were taking their meds, that they were stable, and then they let them out of there. And I'd be in there for 3-4 hours. You know, and that after several months, that started getting out, and it hit my boss, who was kind of wondering, well, what are you doing in there, sitting in there with a psychotic who might have been a psychotic killer or somebody who got into real trouble? Well, what are you doing in there for 4 hours? You know, and I couldn't tell him. I couldn't say. I couldn't tell them what I was seeing, what I was hearing, what I was learning. When they started recovering and going off their meds and not showing any symptoms, that wasn't supposed to happen. In the mind of psychiatry, that was not supposed to happen. And it wasn't supposed to happen over and over again, especially. And they saw for themselves that these guys were no longer psychotic. And what really triggered it, and I was thinking, well, they're going to be thrilled with this because they're paying a lot of money for those antipsychotic drugs. You know, if they can reduce their cost, they should be happy. And these guys are going to go out and the voices that got them in the prison in the first place are going to be gone. They're going to be able to function like normal citizens again. I went, they're going to be thrilled with this. You know, so I would tell them, tell my boss, hey, this guy recovered. Yeah. And the reaction wasn't what I thought it would be at all. He started pacing like he had some demon in him or something. He was just very worried. He started pacing back and forth, back and forth. He told the chief psychologist, and the chief psychologist got upset. And what he did was sent over my boss to start questioning the prisoners I worked with who had recovered. And they knew what he was up to. And they wouldn't give him any information. They wouldn't tell him anything, which was, the greatest compliment I've ever gotten. So here I was being protected by all these criminals who were supposed to be psychotic and out of their minds, and they're protecting me. And I remember one, he asked the guy, the prisoner had completely recovered, and my boss asked him, what are you doing in there with him? What's going on? And he said, well, he's helping us, not like you, asshole. Oh, he could have gone all day without saying that, Yeah. So that just poured gasoline. It was like throwing gasoline on a fire.
Wow.
So
I have a question, Jerry. I really want to know how you help people, i.e., how you've helped them get well, because the thing about people not taking their meds because it feels like poison, and it really does. It feels like you're being poisoned. I've been working as a psychotherapist for 20 years, and almost every person that's ever come through on antidepressants or anti-anxiety drugs of any description, for example, they feel sick from poison. They feel poisoned by it.
Yes.
Yeah. This is normal. These drugs are not healthy.
No, they are not healthy. They are poison.
A lot of them want to come off.
Yeah, they have their place. Like I said, there's a lot of patients I could not reach if the voices weren't calmed down enough for me to get through.
Okay. So tell me a bit about the place of drugs, because we know there's no chemical imbalance. I'd like you to talk about that, because we've talked about that off screen, but we haven't talked about it on screen yet. We know there's no chemical imbalance that these drugs are correcting. So what are they doing?
What they're doing is calming the patient down. All right. That is not what the voices want to happen. Keep in mind, these things are energy parasites. Virtually everything they're telling the patient is negative, fearful, shameful, guilt-ridden. It's all negative. Now, that's one of the first things that hit me is, okay, if these are hallucinations are completely random. They're positive, they're negative, they're all over the place. There is no pattern to them whatsoever. But I noticed in every patient I work with, 98% of what the voices told them was negative and awful. All right. What held them to that pattern? Why weren't they random like all other hallucinations? They ran perfectly predictable patterns, and a hallucination does not do that. So the question that has to be asked is, why is the content of the voices consistently, unswervingly negative all the time? It's a predictable pattern that happens. So since psychiatry believes they're hallucinations and they're not asking questions about how they operate, what they do, what they say, they're hallucinating. So they're just taking the chief symptom of psychosis, of schizophrenia, and they're just throwing out the window. And what's psychotic about that is their behavior when a schizophrenic goes to them and says, hey, the voices are telling me to kill myself. Man, they react like somebody poked them in the butt with a hot poker. Oh, they jump up and, oh, he's suicidal. He's not going to suicide on my watch. Okay, we're going to fill him with drugs and we're going to lock him in this room, and he's going to be locked in there in a padded room until he is no longer suicidal. And then we'll let him out. And then we'll watch him to make sure he's taking his drugs. He ain't going to suicide on my watch. He ain't.
It's such a paradox.
So they believe that there's a threat when the voices are telling the patient to kill themselves, and there actually is, because their suicide rate is, astronomical compared to the rest of the population. But anything else the voices tell them is completely disregarded. Now you talk about psychosis. Here's a split that, oh yeah, we'll listen to them because we've been in trouble before with schizophrenic patients killing themselves, and it doesn't look good for us if they suicide on our watch. But anything else that the voices tell these patients is garbage. It's a hallucination. Now these voices are not, what do they call, word salad. They are not just voices saying crazy stuff that makes no sense. They speak in complete sentences. They have their own strange personalities. They're constantly speaking to the person, and if you look, the pattern is to upset them.
Okay, and once they're upset, what happens?
Once they're upset, then what happens is something that's really strange, and I was denying this for years also, is that once they're upset and the voices attack, and they hit them all night and they're screaming at them, and some of the worst of those episodes is where there's a number of voices all jumping on them at once. And time after time after time, the patients would tell me after they hit, I'm completely drained. I don't have any energy. I remember one inmate telling me, they were on me all night. They were attacking me all night. I was so drained of energy that I could not even get out of bed. So for years, I knew there was a one-to-one correspondence between the voices hitting these patients and their energy disappearing.
Okay.
But I thought that was due to the extreme anxiety that they create, because they create it's a horror show. It's an absolute horror show. And the anxiety is horrendous.
I remember that my own experience was this deep.
Yeah, they keep them awake. They don't let them sleep. They don't let them eat. You've been through it all.
Yeah.
Then one day, I always ended up in the most dangerous, most volatile units, and I was kind of like an adrenaline junkie, so that was okay with me, but it got a little rough at times. They had assigned me to the jail for the prison complex. That means out of this 1,500 prisoners or 1,000 prisoners, however many were on that complex, the worst of the worst went to this jail for the prison. The ones who were protective custody, the ones who were so unstable, the gang members, the people who killed people. They were all locked in this jail.
Within the prison?
Within the prison. So it was a jail within the prison. So it was the worst of the worst were there. And it so happened one day I'm kind of sitting in my office, and here comes these two they called them kites. They were messages that came through interoffice mail. One was from the captain of the CDU, the Central Detention Unit, which was this jail, saying, listen, I've just got a complaint from one of the prisoners who is housed with somebody who is hearing voices. He's in there because he snitched off gang members, and they've been trying to kill him for the last couple of months. The other one is a psychotic guy in the same room with him who was floridly psychotic. He was way gone. And he would wake up at 3 a.m. or not go to sleep, and he'd be standing over his cellmate, just staring down at him while he slept. He'd pace the room all night, and they're locked in the same cell together. So it's like, okay. Went over there, and I pulled the first guy I pulled up was the guy who was not psychotic, who the gang members were trying to kill. And they'd already stabbed him once. They tried to kill him once. And they have this message thing they do there, which is absolutely amazing. They can throw a note across the entire cell block floor on a string. You know, and they do, I've seen it only once or twice, but they somehow tie a string to it and they throw that note and it goes all the way across the cell block into underneath the door of a cell across the unit. So we're talking about, I'd say the distance was probably at least 50 feet.
Wow.
You know, and this note would go flying across the floor into the room under the door of this, and they're doing this behind a metal door with only just a window there, so they can't really see where they're throwing this thing. So it's absolutely amazing. I see that thing shoot across the floor, goes under the door of the next cell across the way, and then the string is retracted without the notes, and it all happens in a period of a few seconds. And it's like under the door. So here they are. They wanted the snitch guy, who was not psychotic, who he snitched off a big drug deal, and the gangsters wanted him dead, and they wanted him dead so bad that some of them purposely got in trouble. So they would be sent to the central detention unit, so they would have a shot at killing him before they moved him somewhere else. So they would send him all these notes under the door saying, "You come out of there, you're a dead man. You know, we're after you, we're waiting for you, we're here. You know, first chance we get, you're dead." You know, and they would, you know, through the window, and they'd scream at him and stuff like that. I mean, you couldn't be under more stress than that. You know, it just outside of war. I mean,
so what was the result? What happened, Sharon?
Well, I pulled him up, and I'm watching him ascend there were 2 flights of stairs that he had to ascend to get into the interview room near the control where I was. And he just flew up those steps like nothing. I mean, he just had plenty of energy. During the interview, he had plenty of energy. You know, he was no lack of energy on his part. You know, and he was telling me all these horrible things. They'd stabbed him. They tried to kill him. He had to come out with guards. They couldn't let him out of the cell by himself. They had to escort him everywhere he went. And they were both in the same cell, so this was a perfect matched experimental situation. After I was done with him, I sent him back, and went, man, this guy is, not only are they trying to kill him, he's locked in this cell with this florid psychotic who's standing over him at 3 a.m. staring at him, and this guy had hurt somebody on the outside, and that's why he's here. He just couldn't be under more stress than that guy. And yet he had tons of energy. He flew up those steps. He answered the interview questions quickly, and he went back down. And then I watched as the florid psychotic cellmate came out of his cell and walked up those steps. He could barely make it up those steps. Like, my screen is frozen with you on it. Can you still hear me?
I can hear you fine, yeah. I can hear you fine.
Okay. So...
So how many years into your...
Now, let me finish this one, because this is an important point. This is a very important point. He could barely make it up those steps. In the interview, he could barely answer. He didn't have any energy whatsoever.
Wow.
Now, the important thing about this is they were both in the same cell. I mean, this is a perfect experimental control. They were eating the same food. They were in the same place. They were under the same routine. Everything was matched. Everything was matched, the same guards. I mean, it was like a perfect experimental situation that had happened completely by serendipity. Yet the psychotic guy barely had enough energy to survive. I mean, he was just barely making it. After I finished with that interview, it became very clear that my thinking that this was anxiety that was causing that loss of energy was wrong. It was wrong. Yet every single time the voices attacked, these guys would have no energy. Then it clicked. something else is accounting for their energy, and there's a one-to-one correspondence between their energy disappearing and these voices appearing. It was then I knew that it was the voices that were somehow responsible for taking that energy, but I have no idea how they did it. What I did experience is I found myself, I found the schizophrenics very interesting. And, I started working out with as many as, working with as many as I could. And then I found I was drained. And I learned that if I worked with more than 2 in a day, when I got back off of work, I didn't have enough energy to do anything else when I got back. So it's like, what is going on here? So I made a rule that never to work with more than 2 in a day. And even then I felt drained when I got out of there. So somehow these things, correspond, there being a one-to-one correspondent doesn't prove anything. But the more of these people I spoke to, I mean, that corresponds with it. Every time the voices appeared, they were drained, and it was always negative. That was always, the voices would turn their emotional state negative, with all this negative crap. And I didn't realize it, but they had to turn that energy, that emotional energy, negative before they could take it. Prisoners who were in much better frame of mind, they didn't bother with them. So they can't make it themselves. So what they're doing to us, and it happens to all of us, not just them, it happens to us at a different level.
Yeah.
But yourself, every once in a while, you'll have a zinger fly into your head, and it's like, where did that come from? Some negative thing that just horrifies you. Like, I'd never do that. Where'd that come from? You feel shameful just even thinking about it. It's kind of like, whoa, that's not my thought. So why those medicines work is because they calm these guys down. Once they're calmed down, the voices can't generate the amount of negative emotional energy that they can generate when they're not calmed down. So basically, it's like a big Band-Aid. The only reason those medicines work is because they calm these people down, and the voices can't get them as upset. So the voices don't want them taking anything that calms them down. They don't even want them using marijuana. I don't know how many patients told me they don't like me using marijuana. They want me to use alcohol, or their favorite drug is amphetamine. They love amphetamine. I've had prisoners tell me that when they ran out of amphetamine, their voices would tell them where to go get it and when to be there, and somebody would show up with it, a complete stranger.
So like these entities knew where to send them?
Yeah. I thought for a while that the entities only knew what was in the patient's head, and that proved to be completely wrong. And I thought for a long while, why I wasn't afraid of them for a long while, even though they were telling these guys, the prisoners, they were telling them the same thing I told you. Don't listen to this guy, get out of his office, attack him. Now, the whole time I was working in the prison, and this was a very fine balancing act, because here you have prisoners who are not very trustful in the first place. They've had a history, you're talking about schizophrenic or psychotic prisoners here. They have a history of being abused by psych and psychiatry, and medicated and dumbed down and locked up and put on suicide watch and stuffed full of drugs. So their trust level for somebody like me is in the friggin' dumps.
Yeah, absolutely.
So I had to find out. It took years to figure out how to talk to them. And
give me a few pointers, because I've had a few schizophrenics through my practice.
Well, the first thing that I found is that when I was still, kind of programmed by all the brainwashing educational system, I believed that they were hallucinations also. And I still wanted to know about them, but the minute that one of these patients saw that I was thinking that these things were hallucinations, they would just clam up. That was it. They wouldn't tell me anything else, and they would just withdraw.
Yeah.
So I remember hitting a point where, well, you know, at least give them the benefit of the doubt that maybe they're not, you know, and, you know, I was still denying. I mean, by that time, anybody else would have probably went, yeah, these are entities, but I was still denying it. I was like, no, this is probably some form of their unconscious mind speaking out, you know. And I would deny it and deny it, and here's all this stuff coming up, like they don't like going into church. Patients are at the state hospital told me the voices would do one of three things depending on their strength level if they went to a church. If the voices were weak, they would shut up when they went to a church. If they were moderate in strength, they would babble and try to distract the guy so he couldn't hear anything the preacher was saying. If they were strong, they would actually drive him out of the church. And I've seen in some sessions where somebody would just jump up and just bolt out of the church. That's one of those guys. Yeah. So they don't like that kind of stuff. They don't like preachers. They don't like the Bible. And there was one time at the state hospital where I found that interesting. So what I did is I got a couple of them, and this is why I got into trouble a few times. I got a section of a horror book, you know, that one of them was reading. They're attracted to negative stuff. They'll look at murder mysteries on TV. They'll look at war movies. They'll look at all this negative stuff, and that feeds these things. Mm-hmm. So one of the first things that needs to stop is they have to stop this negative reinforcement of these things. Mm-hmm. So I got one paragraph from one of these murder mysteries they were reading, and another matching in length from the Bible. And I would let them read one, and then after they read it, to write down everything that they remembered about that passage. You know, so they'd read the negative one first, they'd write down all this stuff, and then they read the Bible passage, and they virtually remembered nothing about any, and it wasn't just the Bible, it was any positive spiritual anything. They didn't remember hardly anything of what that said, and what they remembered of the negative stuff was like 2 or 3 times more. And this happened time after time after time. And I'm like, what's going on there? What is happening here? You know? So we had that going on. And there was a bunch of other stuff like that. I mean, there was the energy drain. There was the not knowing, that kind of stuff. The preacher there would sometimes throw these ice cream socials. This is where I first noticed it. Where all the patients in the rehab center would go down to the ice cream social down in the lobby, and all my schizophrenics would be sitting in their rooms. They didn't want to go. I'm like, well, why aren't you down there? After the sermon, the preacher would give them cake and ice cream, which was like a big thing there. All the other patients were down there, with all these other diagnoses, none of the schizophrenics. Well, why aren't you down there having ice cream and cake? I don't want to go. They stay in these dingy rooms instead. Well, why? Well, we don't like preachers. I don't like the Bible. I mean, there was this negative reaction to anything that was positively spiritual. And the voices themselves were negative. At that point, I didn't know exactly what they were saying, because I didn't know how to talk to these guys. So what I found inch by inch is, once I found something out about the voices that I didn't know before, I'd start this little collection, and I would give them, like, okay, I know this about the voices, I know that about the voices, I know this about the voices, what else can you tell me? And that it was like, woo, they would like, wow, somebody's listening, somebody really wants to know, and they would add another bit. So every bit that came in, I would use that on the new patients, and they were the ones that were telling me. But they had to get to the point where they trusted you, and they tune out psychiatrists, and psychologists. I mean, I watched one of the clinical psychologists work with one time at the hospital. I got into one of the sessions, and basically the psychologist was telling them to ignore these things. Don't pay any attention to them. They're not real. So after that, a couple of sessions I watched with the psychologist and this guy, I looked this patient up, and I brought him in my office, and I said, well, Dr. L has advised you to not listen to these things and ignore them. I said, how's that working? He says, it's not. They get louder. When I try to ignore them, they get louder. And I'm like, what kind of hallucination would steer people away from the Bible or out of church and get louder, you know, if you try to ignore them? I mean, here's these patterns, and they were set patterns. And still, I was like, yeah, well, it's got to be some kind of, you know, some kind of, and even when that gal told me at the end of the 7 years that these things were telling her not to take her meds, I was still in denial that they were entities. You know, I was thinking this is some kind of...
What had to change in you, Jerry, when you finally realized that these, you know, the denial broke down, and after all those years of trying to make sense of it in any other way, apart from them being entities, attachments, what happened to you?
It had to be... I'll tell you what actually happened. I mean, it just blew me away. It just blew me away. So this happened. I mean, here's 7 years I spent at the state hospital asking patients about the voices. After 7 years and everything they told me, I'm still thinking, no, these can't be entities. These can't be demons. These are some part of their subconscious. And I mean, my denial system it was like somebody took a machine gun to it, you know, and here's all these holes in it. Here's all these patterns that the voices run. They, you know, they're not hallucinations because they have all these patterns that hallucinations don't run repeatable patterns all the time, you know, and still I'm denying this. And it's probably far past the point where anybody else would, and I'm still doing this.
Well, so many people have. Many people don't know this. So
well, even though I knew it, I'm still denying it. So where it broke down was in the prison. Okay, so I went through this episode that I just told you about with the CDU and the jail. Okay, and what I had around me all the time in the prison, there were so many schizophrenics, and most of them weren't willing to talk about their voices. But I had a small group that I really watched over closely, who were willing. They were as interested in what the voices were and how they operated as I was. And once we got to some kind of agreement and kind of trusted one another, they would tell me everything their voices would tell them, you know. And while we were in the session, you know, I'd say, well, how are your voices reacting to this? I mean, how are they reacting to that? We started out with a rubber band, you know, because I read Carl Wickland's thing, and I was working with a fellow named Wilson Van Dusen at the time. He was a clinical psychologist and a Swedenborgian who had already studied Swedenborg's works, Heaven and Hell, and a lot of the others. He knew that these things matched what he had read in the spiritual writings of Swedenborg. So he started asking them questions and experimenting with them and talking with them. So he knew that they weren't hallucinations, but he wrote in such a way where he called them hallucinations, but operationally, you know, the way he described them, they weren't. So he was kind of like hedging his bets real closely, because if he just came out and said, no, you know, these things are entities, and just straight up, but he went all the way through his writings calling them hallucinations. So where it broke for me was I would try all these things that interfered with them, and they didn't like that. And the group I had would come back and say, well, I did this, and they went berserk. They didn't like it. The general operation I had was, okay, if they don't like it, shove more of it down their throats. You know, now if I did that in the state hospital, I'd be in trouble right away. But in the prison, you know, these things act up, and the guy screams or hollers and rants and raves, or he acts up a while. He comes back in, he goes, well, they kept me awake all night, and they did this, and they got more intense. And well, yeah, that's good. They don't like it. You know, let's give them some more. You know, you couldn't get away with that at the state hospital. So after reading Wickland's thing, he was using static electricity, which one voice told him it would drive them out. and into his wife, who was a psychic, and then they would talk the voice into the light, and once they did that and it disappeared into the light, something met it, that voice was gone. You know, I tried the same thing later on, and it did work. That voice would gone. But if nothing changed, they would come back. So the breaking point for me was that I was feeding all these things that the voices didn't like and asking the prisoners to do those things and come back and report on it. And then they came back, and all of them were saying, the voices hate your guts. They don't want me coming here. I went to get up this morning. I got a headache. They were telling me all the way here not to come, to go back, to turn back. Don't go there. Don't listen to the guys. You're crazy. He's an idiot, a fool, you know. And they would come anyway because they knew I understood. And they were telling the patients, or they were telling this select group of mine, you know, stay away from them. And then they started reporting one guy. I remember him. He turned around in the doorway on his way out after one of the visits, and he said, "You know what you're doing is dangerous, don't you?" And I'm like, "Yeah, I hadn't thought about it," because at that point, I thought whatever these things were, they were stuck in the guy's head. They were in them. You know, they couldn't come out.
You've got an amazing story. I want to hear this story. You know, so the one I mean, don't you?
So here I'm thinking, hey, you know, screw them, whatever they say, you know, it's a bunch of crap, you know, I'm not afraid of those things. They're stuck in there. They can't get me. The only way they can get me is by convincing the patient to attack me, and they hadn't been successful at that over years, you know, maybe 2 decades. They had not been successful in getting these guys to attack me, even though those people are telling me that the voices are telling them to attack me.